We hear about climate crisis all the time, but what does a large-scale crisis actually look like on the ground? Not as some distant headline, but as a series of real, impossible choices. So in this explainer, we're going to dissect the anatomy of a societal collapse, ripple by terrifying ripple, and we're using a meticulously researched novel as our guide. It really all begins with a single number: 8, 90, 5. See, this was the absolute critical water level for Lake Mead. You could call it the point of no return. Below this, the Hoover Dam can't generate power, and, crucially, it can't get water to Phoenix. This wasn't just some warning sign. This was the mathematical start of the end.
And this line, wow, it just sets the tone perfectly, doesn't it? This wasn't some surprise flood or a sudden earthquake. This was a slow-motion catastrophe, and it was being tracked with terrifying precision by the very people whose job it was to stop it.
So it all boils down to this one huge question. What actually happens when the taps run dry in a city of millions? The story we're looking at isn't just some made-up tale. Think of it more like a really detailed simulation of a potential future, one built on real-world data and actual climate projections. All right, so let's look at that first ripple. It radiates out from this core failure. We get to see it through the eyes of the Water Authority director as he watches his city's final countdown timer. A countdown that's defined by cold, hard math, not by hope. Now, what's so fascinating here is how fast these projections shrink. The optimistic baseline, 90 days of reserves, that assumed everyone would behave rationally. But of course, when panic sets in, people start hoarding water, and that timeline just plummets, first to 60, then to 40 days. It turns out, human nature, it just throws gasoline on the fire, accelerating the collapse way faster than any of the models predicted.
Okay, so here's a really critical distinction. The term dead pool means the water level is too low to flow out of the dam. But for Phoenix, the most terrifying thing was hitting the functional dead pool long before the literal one. I mean, imagine that. You could still see this massive lake right there, but it was completely out of reach. Not a single drop could get to the city.
So how in the world did they get here? Well, this chart really shows you the root cause. We're talking about decades of explosive, totally unsustainable growth that more than doubled the population. An entire modern city, a metropolis, built on a single fatal assumption, that the water would be infinite. I mean, this quote from a city official, it's just a total gut punch. It shows you how fast a crisis like this strips away all the social niceties. Suddenly, your right to live in your own home, it's not a given anymore. It's based on your economic value to a system that's literally dying. So that big systemic failure, well, that creates the next ripple, the human one. And this is where we shift from the spreadsheets to the street, following a resident named Sarah and her family, as they have to confront the brutal reality of leaving everything they've ever known behind. And this is where you really see the harsh math of survival. Think about it. When your entire day's water fits into just a few jugs, every single drop is a decision, a choice. Do you take a quick shower or do you flush the toilet? Do you use it for drinking or for cleaning? Your daily life becomes this constant, stressful calculation with absolutely zero margin for error. And while families are literally counting drops of water to survive, something else is happening. The crisis creates this brutal inequality, and you see it right here in this contrast. For most people, it's a desperate struggle to survive. But for a few others, scarcity becomes a golden opportunity to profit. The end doesn't start with some formal declaration from the government. Nope, it starts just like this, what they call a silent evacuation. Long before any official plan is announced, people see the writing on the wall and they just leave. And this creates this massive, unmanaged migration that clogs the arteries out of the city. A crisis before the crisis even officially begins. Okay, so from the individual level, the crisis just keeps rippling out, this time to the national level. Here we follow a FEMA official as she tries to grapple with a local emergency that is rapidly overwhelming federal institutions and threatening to cascade right across the country. 15 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That was the worst-case projection for the number of displaced people from the Southwest. We're talking about an internal migration on a scale the United States had just never, ever seen before. This wasn't a local disaster anymore. It was a permanent national demographic shift. And the official response? Well, this chart tells a pretty stark story. FEMA knew exactly what was needed,
but they were only given about 60% of the funding they required. And that gap isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It represents thousands of impossible choices about who gets life-saving help and who gets left behind.
And this quote, man, it just perfectly sums up the whole tragedy of institutional failure. The warnings were there, the data was crystal clear, but the response came too late with too little. That gap, that space between knowing something is coming and actually acting on it, that's where a crisis becomes a catastrophe. All right, our next ripple is the economic one, the Great Reckoning. We see it through the eyes of a developer who actually got rich from Phoenix's unsustainable growth. And his story forces us to take a really hard look at the moral consequences of a system that was built on a lie. You know, this developer's whole arc is just fascinating. He profits from the whole mess, gets out right before it all crashes, but then he's forced to actually look at the human cost of the very system he helped build. And in the end, he starts reinvesting his expertise not in more growth, but in real sustainability, a personal reckoning that kind of mirrors the bigger economic one. And this brings us to the final and maybe most unsettling ripple. Because a crisis like this doesn't just end, it transforms. It creates a new, unstable reality. This isn't about rebuilding what was lost. It's about adapting to a landscape that has been permanently changed, both for the people who were displaced and for the cities that have to take them in. Just look at this fictional census data. It really quantifies the massive seismic shift we're talking about. A loss of over 9 million people in the Southwest, a huge influx of people into the Pacific Northwest and the mountain regions. This isn't just a migration. It's the largest single-year redistribution of population in American history. And here's the kicker. This shows you that no place is really safe. The cities that took people in, like Portland, they're now buckling under the strain. They're forced to implement residency controls and face their own water restrictions. The crisis didn't get solved. It just moved and changed its shape. And that right there brings us to the most chilling conclusion of all. This isn't a one-time event, like a hurricane that's over and done with. The underlying conditions, the drought, the heat, they haven't gone away. The collapse isn't over. In fact, it's projected to keep going and to spread. And all of this leaves us with one last really provocative question. In this new normal, where you're constantly adapting, just reacting isn't enough. After buying themselves a little bit of time in a new place, the characters, and by extension all of us, are left to ask, what's the next intentional move? In a world where nowhere is permanently safe.